Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time to a place where your modern comforts are just a distant dream, and the word sanitation barely existed. You trudge through a narrow dirt lane, cobblestones uneven beneath your boots, as the smell of burning wood mingles with the unmistakable stench of unwashed bodies and livestock. A chicken clucks wildly nearby, and a cart will squeak somewhere off to your left. Welcome to a medieval village, where every day feels like a challenge designed specifically to test your patience and your immune system. Honestly, you probably wouldn't last a day here without wondering if you'd been transported into some sort of survival reality show. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, why not drop your location and local time in the comments? I'm curious where you're tuning in from as we wander these dusty streets together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine the village bustling as you make your way through the morning crowd. The air is thick, partly with the smell of fresh bread baking in communal ovens, but mostly with less pleasant odors, animal dung, uncollected waste, and the less talked about but very real scent of unbathed humans. This wasn't a quick oops, forgot my deodorant situation. Bathing was an occasional event, reserved for special occasions or royal visits, and running water was a luxury. You'd probably clutch your nose and think, how do people live like this? Well, they did, because they had to. The sounds around you are a mix of shouted bargains from merchants, the braying of donkeys, and children's laughter echoing off timber-framed buildings. But don't let that cheerful noise fool you. This village is a place where disease waits in the shadows, and simple cuts could become deadly infections. Historians still argue whether the widespread plagues were worsened by the conditions here or simply inevitable given the limited medical knowledge. You spot a street vendor hawking oddly shaped vegetables and another with baskets of live rabbits. Street food is common, but you wonder how many meals began as probably undercooked or questionably fresh. The local blacksmith pounds rhythmically, sparks flying, while a group of peasants pause nearby, wiping sweat from their brows. Everyone is part of a delicate ecosystem of survival, where every moment brings new tiny challenges, from dodging horse manure to avoiding the inquisitive eyes of a lord's tax collector. Yet, amidst all this, there's a rhythm to the day that you'd find oddly soothing once you get used to it, if you survive long enough to get used to anything. Remember that the medieval village wasn't just a backdrop of hardship. It was home, full of stories, hopes, and the occasional absurdity that would make you smile in disbelief. So, as you stand here, inhaling the blend of aromas and hearing the chorus of village life, remind yourself, this is the world you'd be waking up to every day if you were lucky enough, or unlucky enough, to live in medieval times. You step further into the medieval market, and immediately the senses go into overdrive. It's like you've walked into a symphony of smells, sounds, and colors, though, truth be told, not all of those notes are exactly pleasant. You're greeted by the heavy scent of fermented cabbage, mingling with the sharp tang of spilled vinegar and the earthy aroma of fresh hay stacked in neat bundles beside wooden stalls. Somewhere nearby, a butcher is loudly hawking his cuts, and you catch a faint whiff of something slightly less appetizing, maybe a hint of unwashed fish or day-old cheese left out in the sun. Welcome to the market, the medieval version of sensory overload. Here, the market isn't just a place to shop, it's the social hub, the beating heart of the village where everything happens. Farmers, craftsmen, and traders gather from nearby villages, bringing their goods and their stories. The cacophony of voices blends with the clatter of wooden carts and the clucking of chickens, making it almost impossible to focus on any single thing for too long. Navigating this chaos isn't for the faint of heart. You have to dodge barrels leaking sour cider, stray dogs sniffing for scraps, and the occasional child chasing after a rolling hoop. Your nose twitches at the mixture of scents, rotten vegetables discarded near the smithy, the smoky haze from a nearby hearth where some poor cook is struggling to prepare something vaguely edible. Historians still argue whether the smell was just a part of life or a major contributor to the frequent outbreaks of illness, but for now, you just try to breathe through your mouth. Food stalls offer an array of curious options: large wheels of cheese coated in ash, bundles of herbs tied together with twine, and flatbreads baked over open flames. You might be surprised to learn that medieval people actually had a pretty varied diet compared to what many imagine, though the quality depended heavily on your social status. The poor often ate pottage, a thick, hearty stew made from grains and vegetables simmered together, sometimes with bits of meat or fish if they were lucky. Amidst the market's bustle, you notice a strange little cart covered in strange jars and bottles, where a vendor insists that his miracle potions can cure everything from bad breath to the plague. His sales pitch is so convincing that a few gullible customers step up, eagerly handing over their coins. These mixtures often included bizarre ingredients like crushed beetles or powdered bones, And while you might smirk at the idea now, desperate times called for desperate measures. Historians still argue whether these remedies did any good at all, or if they simply provided comfort through the power of belief. Your ears pick up a lively argument between two merchants over the price of wool. They gesture dramatically, speaking in the local dialect, while a nearby juggler entertains a small crowd with his flaming clubs. It's not just a market, it's an experience, a sensory tapestry woven from the sights, sounds, and smells of medieval life. Interestingly, the market was also a place where news traveled fast. You might overhear gossip about a distant war, a bad harvest, or a strange comet seen in the sky, things that would have real impacts on your life here. Traders would bring tales from faraway lands, exotic goods, and stories that fed the collective imagination of the village. The marketplace's layout reflects the priorities and customs of the time. Butchers and fishmongers often positioned their stalls downwind to keep odors away from the main thoroughfares, while bakers used communal ovens in central locations. Street musicians and entertainers made the rounds, adding a touch of levity to the hard day's work. One quirky detail you might not expect: people sometimes used animals to communicate prices or quality. For instance, a merchant might carry a brightly colored parrot, signaling his exotic goods, or a clever dog trained to retrieve coins from customers. These little spectacles were not just practical but added a bit of flair to the marketplace drama. The marketplace also exposed you to the early roots of commerce and trade regulations. Guilds, early versions of trade unions, oversaw standards of quality and pricing, and you'd be wise to respect their rules or risk a fine. Some guild members would wear badges or special aprons to denote their trade, giving you clues about who to trust. As you move through this swirl of activity, you might pause at a spice stall, where fragrant cinnamon, cloves, and pepper remind you that even medieval villagers craved exotic tastes. These spices traveled vast distances along early trade routes, arriving here after long journeys from Asia and the Middle East. The silk routes weren't just for silks, after all. But beyond the food and goods, the market also reveals the social fabric of the village. Here, you see peasants rubbing elbows with minor nobles, servants haggling alongside wealthy merchants, and children darting between the crowds. It's a place where the hierarchy blurs for a moment, and everyone plays a part in the daily dance. You might be surprised to learn that some markets operated on a weekly schedule, turning the quiet village streets into a bustling center of commerce on market day, then returning to calm for the rest of the week. This ebb and flow influenced the rhythms of life for miles around. In the background, the clanging of the blacksmith's hammer echoes, a reminder that while the market might be all about food and trade, the village's survival depended on craftsmanship, from horseshoes to tools. You briefly wonder if the smith's apprentice ever gets to take a break, or if he's resigned to a life of sparks and sweat. And finally, as you step away from the noise and smells, you realize how the medieval market was more than just a place to buy and sell. It was a sensory experience, a social network, and a reminder that life, even in its most boring moments, had its own rhythm and quirks. So, next time you pass a bustling farmer's market or a crowded city square, remember the medieval marketplace's symphony of chaos, and be glad you don't have to dodge chicken feathers and vinegar spills just to buy your dinner. You find yourself walking along a narrow path carved into a steep cliffside, the distant roar of waves crashing against jagged rocks below barely audible over the breeze. This isn't just any trail, it's part of the ancient Silk Roads, those legendary trade routes that connected east and west, stretching thousands of miles across deserts, mountains, and steppe lands. It's hard to imagine how anyone managed to transport delicate silk threads, spices, and precious metals over such unforgiving terrain, but here you are, retracing their steps. You probably wouldn't last a day as a caravan trader, juggling camels, bandits, and sandstorms. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I'm curious where in the world you're tuning in from tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into the winding journey of the Silk Roads. The Silk Roads were not just one road, but a network of interconnected paths weaving through Central Asia, linking China, India, Persia, Arabia, and Europe. You can almost hear the clip-clop of camel hooves and the creak of wooden carts laden with goods. The primary commodity, of course, was silk, delicate, shimmering fabric prized by emperors and commoners alike. But along with silk traveled an astonishing variety of goods, fragrant spices like cinnamon and cardamom, rare gems, glassware from the Roman world, and even ideas and religions. Caravans had to prepare meticulously for months, packing food, water, and goods, plus plenty of patience. Camels, the ships of the desert, carried heavy loads but needed frequent watering stops. Along the way, travelers encountered oases, tiny islands of life where merchants rested, traded stories, and exchanged goods. These oases were as vital as the goods themselves, offering shade, water, and a chance to recover from the harsh desert sun. One quirky fact you might enjoy: traders sometimes carried specially trained pigeons to send messages between distant points on the route. These feathered messengers might seem charming now, but back then, they were an essential part of communication and even espionage. Historians still argue whether the Silk Roads truly promoted peaceful cultural exchange or primarily enriched powerful empires at the expense of local populations. Either way, the trade routes facilitated the spread of technologies, religions like Buddhism and Islam, and artistic styles across continents. You pause to imagine a marketplace at Samarkand or Kasha, vibrant hubs along the Silk Roads where merchants from distant lands gathered. The air would be filled with the scents of exotic spices, the chatter of dozens of languages, and the sight of colorful textiles fluttering in the breeze. These cities were melting pots of culture and commerce, fostering innovations that shaped the medieval world. The journey wasn't without its dangers. Sandstorms could bury entire caravans, bandits lurked in mountain passes, and the shifting politics of empires could turn safe passage into a risky gamble. Yet, despite these hazards, merchants pressed on, driven by the promise of wealth and the thrill of adventure. It's fascinating to note that many of the goods traveled in stages. Rarely did a single trader carry silk all the way from China to Europe. Instead, the fabric changed hands multiple times, gaining value and stories at each stop. This relay system kept the trade vibrant and interconnected. At night, you imagine resting under a star-filled sky in a tent, the flicker of a campfire casting shadows on the sand. The silence, broken only by the soft murmurs of fellow travelers, contrasts sharply with the bustling markets by day. The Silk Roads also influenced daily life far from their roots. For example, the introduction of new foods like rice and citrus fruits changed diets, while new techniques in metalwork and textiles spread across continents. One especially interesting tidbit: some caravans carried medicinal herbs and texts, facilitating early knowledge exchange in medicine and science. Imagine the blend of traditional remedies from China mingling with Greco-Roman medical theories in a dusty trading post. You might smile at the idea that some traders used elaborate seals and codes to protect their goods and agreements, an ancient form of contract law and business practice that foreshadowed modern commerce. As you continue your imagined trek, you realize that the Silk Roads were more than just trade routes. They were arteries of cultural exchange, human resilience, and the endless curiosity that connects us all. Despite the hardships, these journeys shaped the world in ways still felt today. So next time you slip on a silk scarf or enjoy a pinch of exotic spice, remember the perilous and fascinating journey that brought it to you, across deserts, mountains, and centuries. You wake up before dawn, the sky still draped in charcoal grey, as a rooster crows somewhere off in the distance. You're in a medieval European village, and you've somehow found yourself in the woolen tunic and straw-filled mattress of a peasant. There's no alarm clock, no snooze button, and certainly no espresso machine. Instead, your day starts with aching limbs, scratchy fabric, and the dull awareness that you'll be repeating nearly the same routine you did yesterday, and the day before that. The floor of your cottage is cold earth. No wood, no stone, just compacted dirt, sometimes sprinkled with straw to reduce the smell. The single-room hut you share with your family, spouse, children, perhaps an in-law or two, smells faintly of smoke, onions, and livestock. Yes, livestock. The pig you're raising sleeps in the corner. It's warm, and the warmth is worth the smell. Today's work, everything. There's no task list because the answer is always everything. Feeding the animals, mending a thatch roof, tilling a muddy field with a wooden plough and maybe one ox, if you're lucky. Washing clothes in a stream, collecting firewood, and tending to your family's tiny vegetable patch. Medieval peasant life wasn't about dramatic sword fights or courtly love. It was a survivalist's loop of mud, toil, and more mud. Your hands are calloused. Your back always hurts. And you probably wouldn't last a day. Breakfast is coarse dark bread, maybe with some ale or weak porridge. You eat it sitting on a low wooden stool, or maybe just crouched beside the hearth. The concept of breakfast foods doesn't exist yet. No eggs Benedict, no croissants. Just calories, fuel to survive the day's labors. As you shuffle out the creaky wooden door, your boots, rough leather tied with twine, sink into the damp, spongy earth. The village is a scatter of huts, clustered like barnacles around a central open area where chickens cluck and pigs wander. Everyone's up early. You nod to neighbors, some of whom are already elbow-deep in their morning routines. Privacy isn't really a thing. You head to the field. The land isn't yours, it belongs to a local lord, a noble you've maybe never even seen. You're farming it because you have to. In exchange, You get to live on his land, maybe use a strip of it for your own crops. It's called the manorial system, and it's a sweet deal for the noble. You plow, you sow, you sweat. Sometimes, you break to drink from a gourd of ale or eat a bit of yesterday's bread, hardened like a roofing tile. You hear your neighbor complaining about a toothache again. There's no dentist. That tooth's probably going to win this battle. Meanwhile, you keep digging. By mid-morning, your clothes are damp with dew, sweat, and the occasional squirt of animal something. Your ox, if you have one, is stubborn. If you don't have one, then congratulations, you are the ox. There's no lunch hour, just a pause when you feel like you might collapse. Some peasants bring bits of cheese or dried legumes wrapped in cloth. Some make a meal of boiled cabbage, again. Historians still argue whether peasant diets were barely survivable or surprisingly nutritious by accident. Lots of fiber, low sugar, seasonal vegetables, and minimal meat. But one thing's for sure, your taste buds aren't having fun. Let's not forget taxes. You owe a portion of everything you grow to your lord. Then there's the church tithe, 10% of your produce, livestock, or income. Yes, even God collects taxes. And while we're here, the local priest also insists you attend Mass. Thatched roof chapel, hand-copied sermons, probably delivered in Latin. You don't understand it, but you nod along. Now imagine it's a holy day. There are many of them, more than you'd expect. In fact, some years had over 50 mandatory feast days. Sounds like a break, right? Not really. You still work in the morning, then attend Mass, then try to enjoy the festivities. Think, modest ale, basic music, a roasted turnip if you're feeling wild. A particularly odd holiday might involve blessing the fields, dressing up a cow, or chasing away evil spirits by banging pots. Entertainment is homegrown. A juggler passing through. Incredible. A traveling mystery play. Cultural peak. If you fall ill, which happens often, you turn to herbal remedies, local midwives, or saints. Maybe all three. There's a poultice of crushed garlic and pig fat for wounds, or an amulet blessed by a monk to ward off fever. Historians still argue whether these folk cures were entirely useless or occasionally effective. But when the Black Death rolls through, none of it helps. And hygiene. That stream you wash your clothes in is also where people bathe, water animals, and sometimes dump waste. You wash maybe once a week, and it's a whole event. Soap is homemade, often from lye and animal fat. It stings. Back at home, the evening meal is more bread, maybe a stew made from root vegetables and the odd bit of salted meat, if you're lucky. The hearth glows dimly. Children bicker and then fall asleep on piles of hay. You might sing a little, or recite a bit of law. Literacy isn't widespread. If you can read, you're probably the village priest or an unusually lucky peasant whose lord valued education. You lie down, sore and damp and oddly satisfied, knowing you'll do it all again tomorrow. In this life, rest is brief, comfort is rare, and the joy comes in tiny, earthy packages. A newborn lamb, a mild winter, a good harvest. One curious detail. Some medieval peasants actually had 2 sleeps. They'd go to bed after dusk, wake up around midnight, tend to small tasks, maybe visit a neighbor, and then return to sleep until dawn. Historians still debate the reason, but it's a fascinating glimpse into how differently people related to time. Despite the hardship, not everything is bleak. Village life builds strong communal ties. You rely on your neighbors, and they rely on you. When someone is injured or sick, others pitch in. You share tools, trade favors, and raise children together. And yes, there's laughter, plenty of it. Evenings might bring stories, songs, and jokes about the Lord's odd-shaped nose. You might not have a comfortable mattress or enough to eat, but you do have the solace of routine and the loyalty of kin. Peasant revolts are rare, but not unheard of. Push the people too far, raise the taxes, conscript their sons for war, let the harvest fail, and they might band together with pitchforks and fire. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was one such spark of rebellion. Though ultimately crushed, it forced the ruling class to take notice. Seasons rule your life. Winter is lean, cold, and harsh. You might go hungry, shivering beside your hearth, hoping the salted pork lasts. Spring brings mud and planting. Summer, long days and hard work. Autumn, the harvest and preparation for another cycle. As you drift off now, think about the rhythm of peasant life. The gentle repetition, the honest toil, the creaking of cart wheels, and the simple satisfaction of bread fresh from the communal oven. It's a life alien to our digital world but grounded in the most human truths: labor, community, and the hope that tomorrow's sun brings a better yield. You wake up stiff and sore on a straw-filled mattress, tucked into a corner of the servants' quarters in the eastern wing of the castle. Your blanket is more whole than cloth, the stone floor beneath you seems to be leaching the warmth right out of your bones, and, good morning, a mouse has scurried out from your shoes. If you're lucky, it didn't chew through the leather during the night. Welcome to castle life. Despite what fantasy films would have you believe, medieval castles weren't all glitz, banquets, and dragons lounging on treasure piles. They were cold, drafty, noisy, and often smelled like a cross between old soup, unwashed feet, and wet dog. You stretch your arms, trying not to bang your elbow on the low timber ceiling, and steel yourself for another day. Castle life isn't for the faint-hearted, or the faint-stomached. Breakfast, if you're of noble blood, means a hearty bowl of pottage, oats boiled with water or ale, maybe a smattering of honey if the stores are generous. For servants like you, it's crusty bread and whatever leftover broth is available. It's not a meal so much as a warm-up. You'll find yourself walking along a narrow path, hauling buckets of water up and down uneven staircases, roar of waves scrubbing soot out of jagged rocks below, barely trying not to get trampled by the knights practicing. This isn't just any trail in the courtyard. It's part of the ancient Silk Roads, were microcosms legendary trade routes that connected east and west, hierarchy stretching thousands of miles. The lord and lady at the top, mountains, followed by knights, squires. It's hard to imagine how anyone managed to transport delicate silk threads, spices, stable hands, and precious metals over such unforgiving terrain. Everyone has a job, but here you are, everyone has retracing their steps. And heaven help you, probably wouldn't forget a day as a caravan trader, juggling camels, bandits, and sandstorms. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I'm curious where in the world you're tuning in from tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into the winding journey of the Silk Roads. The Silk Roads were not just one road, but a network of interconnected paths weaving through Central Asia, linking China, India, Persia, Arabia, and Europe. You can almost hear the clip-clop of camel hooves and the creak of wooden carts laden with goods. The primary commodity, of course, was silk, delicate, shimmering fabric prized by emperors and commoners alike. But along with silk travelled an astonishing variety of goods, fragrant spices like cinnamon and cardamom, rare gems, glassware from the Roman world, and even ideas and religions. Caravans had to prepare meticulously for months, packing food, water, and goods, plus plenty of patience. Camels, the ships of the desert, carried heavy loads but needed frequent watering stops. Along the way, travelers encountered oases, tiny islands of life where merchants rested, traded stories, and exchanged goods. These oases were as vital as the goods themselves, offering shade, water, and a chance to recover from the harsh desert sun. One quirky fact you might enjoy: traders sometimes carried specially trained pigeons to send messages between distant points on the route. These feathered messengers might seem charming now, but back then, they were an essential part of communication and even espionage. Historians still argue whether the Silk Roads truly promoted peaceful cultural exchange or primarily enriched powerful empires at the expense of local populations. Either way, the trade routes facilitated the spread of technologies, religions like Buddhism and Islam, and artistic styles across continents. You pause to imagine a marketplace at Samarkand or Kasha, vibrant hubs along the Silk Roads where merchants from distant lands gathered. The air would be filled with the scents of exotic spices, the chatter of dozens of languages, and the sight of colorful textiles fluttering in the breeze. These cities were melting pots of culture and commerce, fostering innovations that shaped the medieval world. The journey wasn't without its dangers. Sandstorms could bury entire caravans, bandits lurked in mountain passes, and the shifting politics of empires could turn safe passage into a risky gamble. Yet, despite these hazards, merchants pressed on, driven by the promise of wealth and the thrill of adventure. It's fascinating to note that many of the goods traveled in stages. Rarely did a single trader carry silk all the way from China to Europe. Instead, the fabric changed hands multiple times, gaining value and stories at each stop. This relay system kept the trade vibrant and interconnected. At night, you imagine resting under a star-filled sky in a tent, the flicker of a campfire casting shadows on the sand. The silence, broken only by the soft murmurs of fellow travelers, contrasts sharply with the bustling markets by day. The Silk Roads also influenced daily life far from their roots. For example, the introduction of new foods like rice and citrus fruits changed diets, while new techniques in metalwork and textiles spread across continents. One especially interesting tidbit: some caravans carried medicinal herbs and texts, facilitating early knowledge exchange in medicine and science. Imagine the blend of traditional remedies from China mingling with Greco-Roman medical theories in a dusty trading post. You might smile at the idea that some traders used elaborate seals and codes to protect their goods and agreements, an ancient form of contract law and business practice that foreshadowed modern commerce. As you continue your imagined trek, you realize that the Silk Roads were more than just trade routes. They were arteries of cultural exchange, human resilience, and the endless curiosity that connects us all. Despite the hardships, these journeys shaped the world in ways still felt today. So next time you slip on a silk scarf or enjoy a pinch of exotic spice, remember the perilous and fascinating journey that brought it to you, across deserts, mountains, and centuries. You've made it to the city, and honestly, you might be starting to regret it. Medieval cities aren't quite the bustling hubs of innovation and culture that modern brochures, or video games, might suggest. Instead, imagine a sensory overload of clanging metal, barking dogs, and the constant hum of human activity, plus the unmistakable stench of 14th century sanitation. You step onto the cobblestone street and almost immediately regret your decision. The narrow alleys are barely wide enough for two people to pass, and they're lined with overflowing chamber pots, which people empty from their upper windows with a quick shout of Gardeloo. Assuming they remember to shout at all. So yes, your first order of business, navigating the streets without getting splashed with something suspicious from above. As you shuffle along, you notice a strange mixture of people. Merchants shout the prices of their wares in sing-song tones. Blacksmiths hammer away in open forges, sending sparks flying into the street. Beggars sit at every corner, their hands outstretched. You sidestep a dog gnawing on something unidentifiable and nearly walk straight into a barrow full of eels. That's right, eels. Apparently, they're a common food here. Welcome to medieval gastronomy. Historians still argue whether the cities of the Middle Ages were cleaner than we think or just as filthy as they're portrayed. One fringe theory even suggests that people had a kind of filth immunity, a romantic notion, if only it weren't born out of necessity. But even if the reality lies somewhere in the middle, one thing's for sure, you're going to need a strong stomach to survive this. You pass a fishmonger stall, the air thick with the smell of salt and rotting cod. Flies swarm everywhere. You try to breathe through your mouth, which unfortunately doesn't help. Now imagine trying to shop for dinner here without refrigeration. No wonder everyone seems to prefer dried goods. Inside the butcher's tent, there's a pig's head on a spike. That's not decoration, it's advertising. Cuts of meat hang from hooks, some still twitching from leftover nerves. Sanitation laws. Adorable idea, but not a thing. The city doesn't have a centralized sewer system, so waste often just flows into open drains. If you're lucky, it rains. If you're not, well, the flies certainly appreciate it. You wander into the marketplace, a chaotic square jammed with people, chickens, stray dogs, and carts. Everything is for sale here, cloth dyed in rich colors, pottery with uneven glazing, spices, prayer beads, even teeth, yep, human teeth. You want shoes. They're hand-stitched leather, made by the local cobbler. But don't expect comfort, no arch support, and your socks are made of scratchy wool. The noise is relentless. People haggle, argue, laugh, and occasionally start full-blown fistfights. One baker yells that another's bread is underweight. The city has bread inspectors for this exact reason, armed with official weights and a no-nonsense attitude. You watch one man's loaves get tossed into the gutter for cheating the scale. Wandering further, you spot the public bathhouse. Curious? Sure. Comfortable? Not even slightly. Bathing is communal and a bit scandalous by today's standards. Men and women often share the same bathhouse, sometimes even the same tub, separated by only a polite cough or a floating bit of lavender oil. But bathhouses aren't just for getting clean. They're social hubs, rumour mills, and, occasionally, matchmaking venues. If you're lucky, you'll avoid the dreaded lice combs. Then, there's the City Watch, essentially night shift volunteers with wooden staves. They don't have uniforms, radios, or even reliable lanterns. If you cause a scene, they'll drag you to the pillory in the town square, where punishment is public and humiliating. You'll stand there, arms and head locked in place, as children throw vegetables, or worse. Medieval justice. Swift, theatrical, and mildly unhygienic. You decide to visit a medieval inn. It's not like the warm, candlelit taverns from movies. The interior is smoky and loud, with wooden benches crammed close together. The air smells like stew, beer, and sweat. You find a seat and order the pottage, which is essentially whatever was left in the pot, vegetables, barley, maybe a bone. Still, it's hot and filling, and you don't ask too many questions. The other patrons eye you warily. You're new. You're clean-ish. You don't know the local gossip, and your dialect is off. One man with 2 teeth tries to sell you a magical amulet that's definitely just a snail shell on a string. You politely decline. As night falls, you try to find a place to sleep. Inns are expensive. If you're lucky, you'll find a straw mattress in a shared room. If not, it's the alley behind the blacksmith's, with a pile of hay and a cat named Hobbs who's claimed it as his territory. Either way, you're sharing space, with people, fleas, and an air of medieval uncertainty. Did we mention the curfew? After dark, city gates close, and torches are extinguished. If you're found wandering, the city watch assumes you're up to no good. You better have a candle stub and a believable excuse. Some cities have night soilmen, brave souls who collect waste under cover of darkness. Their carts roll quietly, their footsteps muffled by the sludge. You tip your hat to them, figuratively, of course, because you're not about to take your hand out of your cloak in this cold. And because, well, your hat is probably infested with lice by now. As you doze off, tucked in your itchy blanket, the city hums on. Somewhere, a lute plays. Someone shouts at a thief. A dog barks at a falling star, or maybe just a loose bit of thatch. Life in the medieval city is chaotic, unsanitary, unpredictable, and entirely too much for your 21st century immune system. And yet, there's something oddly enchanting about it all. The smells, the noise, the humanity packed into every crooked timber and muddy path. Still, don't be fooled. You probably wouldn't last a full day here. You're hungry. Again. Not the I skipped lunch kind of hungry, but the sort that comes from trying to survive a typical medieval day on roughly 1,500 calories, most of them from barley gruel. You might think, surely, food in the Middle Ages wasn't that bad. People hunted, they had farms, and they threw feasts, right? Yes, but those feasts were the exception, not the norm. Most of the time, you're chewing through your 5th boiled root vegetable of the week, trying not to think about how it tastes like damp linen. Let's sit you down at the average medieval table and see just what's for dinner, assuming you're lucky enough to have one. Your day begins with breakfast, or breaking your fast, but don't get too excited. For the lower classes, this might just be a chunk of bread and a weak ale. Yes, beer for breakfast, because water might be contaminated. Historians still debate how much alcohol was actually consumed per person, but medieval beer was low in alcohol and safer than untreated well water. If you're a monk, your breakfast might be postponed until mid-morning because of fasting rules, and if you're a noble, you might start the day with meat pies and spiced wine. The class divide starts early and stays strong. Lunch comes around midday. For peasants, it's often more of the same. More bread, more broth, maybe a little cheese or a salted fish if you're lucky. The bread isn't like today's fluffy loaves, either. It's dense, coarse, and probably tastes faintly of the miller's fingers. In parts of Europe, especially northern regions, rye and barley dominated the grains. Wheat was expensive, and white bread was a luxury reserved for the elite. There's a reason some historians call this era the Age of Pottage, because that's what everyone ate, a thick stew of whatever vegetables, grains, and sometimes meat scraps they had on hand. Let's talk meat. Yes, meat existed. But for most people, it wasn't a daily affair. Hunting was restricted in many regions. Royal forests were protected, and being caught poaching could get you severely punished. The nobility dined on venison, boar, swan, even peacock, served in elaborate presentations, often with the feathers reattached for flair. You, dear listener, probably don't have access to the king's kitchen. So you're more likely to eat a salted herring or a bit of pork on holidays. And even then, preserving meat was tricky. Salting, smoking, or drying were common techniques, but refrigeration was a distant dream. How about fruits and veggies? Surely those helped. Yes and no. While fresh produce was consumed, much of it was seasonal and limited to what you could grow or trade. Apples, onions, cabbages, leeks, and garlic were common, as were lentils and peas. But tomatoes, potatoes, and corn? Not in Europe yet. Those are New World crops. Instead, you're trying to find joy in your 3rd bowl of turnip stew, and maybe sweetening it with a drop of precious honey if you're lucky. Speaking of sweeteners, sugar was rare and expensive. Most people relied on honey. The use of spices was another sign of wealth. Spices like cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were imported from Asia, and their presence on a dish was less about flavor and more about flexing your wallet. Pepper. So valuable it was used as currency. For the average household, Seasoning meant salt, if you had it, garlic, or maybe some herbs from the garden. Now let's wander into the kitchen, if there is one. In peasant homes, cooking was often done over an open hearth in the center of the house. Imagine a smoke-filled room, the ceiling black with soot, and a pot that hasn't been truly cleaned in a decade. Kitchens, as we know them, didn't exist. Even wealthier households had separate kitchens, mostly to avoid burning down the entire manor. A fun fringe fact, in some households, they used trenchers, stale hunks of bread, as plates. Once your food soaked through it, you could either eat the trencher or give it to the poor. Efficient, if not exactly appetizing. Cutlery was minimal. Most people used their hands or shared spoons. Forks didn't become widespread in Europe until the late Middle Ages, and even then, some clergy considered them sinful. After all, God gave you fingers. Historians still argue whether famine cycles in the medieval period were mostly natural or man-made, but the evidence shows that food insecurity was a real part of life. Bad harvests, disease, and war all led to shortages. There were entire periods, like the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, where people were forced to eat bark, acorns, or worse. And let's not even get into the rumors of cannibalism during extreme times. Sleep-friendly storytelling has its limits. But food wasn't just sustenance, it was social code. What you ate, how you ate it, when and with whom all sent signals about your class, status, and religion. Catholic feast days and fasting rules governed diet strictly. During Lent, for example, meat, dairy, and eggs were off limits, so people got creative with almond milk and faux meat pies made from fish. There were even loopholes. Beavers, being semi-aquatic, were classified as fish by the church and therefore fair game during fasts. You really can't make this up. In city taverns, you might find cooked meals for sale, a stew or pie, if you had coins to spare. Ale and wine flowed more freely in towns, though drunkenness was discouraged by religious authorities. Eating out was more common in bustling trade hubs or university towns, where students and merchants mingled in smoky, rowdy eateries. But even then, a bad oyster or undercooked meat could put you in a grave. Food poisoning was a very real, very non-metaphorical death sentence. Let's not forget the children. No baby food aisles, no blenders. Babies were weaned on mashed bread, animal milk, or chewed-up food pre-softened by their mothers. Malnutrition was common. And elderly people, if their teeth were gone, they relied on soups, broths, and maybe a generous daughter to soften their crusts. By the time dinner rolls around, which could be around 4 or 5 p.m., it's often more of the same. Maybe a thicker stew, or leftovers from lunch. Nobles might indulge in a multi-course meal with entertainment. You're squatting by a fire, gnawing on a leek. And yet, despite the grimness, there's community. Meals are shared, stories are told, and in times of plenty, food becomes celebration. Fairs, festivals, weddings, all include banquets that momentarily lift you from your barley gruel reality. So, would you survive medieval cuisine? Probably. Would you enjoy it? Only if you can make peace with relentless pottage, mystery meat, and utensils optional. It's morning again, or at least the damp, grimy medieval version of it. You blink your sleep-crusted eyes open on the straw-stuffed pallet that somehow managed to both poke you in the ribs and leave your back damp with mildew. The rooster has already screamed its cheerful alarm, roughly 5 feet from your head, because it lives inside the house with you, your host family, their goat, and what seems to be a very rude duck. Welcome to medieval hygiene, or, more accurately, the lack of it. Your first instinct might be to reach for a toothbrush. Well, good luck with that. Toothbrushes, as you know them, won't exist for another several hundred years. You might chew on a twig or rub your teeth with a cloth, maybe using ashes or salt. But let's be honest, your breath could probably knock out a small rodent. So could everyone else's. Morning halitosis is a community experience now. Your first stop of the day is the chamber pot in the corner, which has been gently fermenting all night. Don't worry, there's a nice little stream nearby where you can dump it later. Or if you live in a city, maybe you'll just chuck it out the window. Garde-zelo. Watch out for the flying waste. This charming custom will continue for centuries, until cities start getting serious about sanitation. Historians still argue whether the stench of urban life or the risk of disease was the real motivator behind those changes. Time to wash up. Or not. Most people in the Middle Ages don't wash their entire bodies daily. Full baths are suspiciously indulgent, especially during certain eras when the church considers them gateways to sin. Public bathhouses exist, but they're associated with more than just cleanliness, if you catch the drift. In some parts of Europe, bathhouses are eventually shut down for moral or plague-related reasons. You can still wipe your face and hands with a bit of cold water, if you're lucky enough to have access to a clean source. Now let's address your wardrobe. You slept in your clothes, which also serve as your work attire, dining outfit, and, unfortunately, toilet waste hauling uniform. Linen undergarments are a luxury. Wool is the material of the masses, itchy, heavy, and excellent at absorbing every odor you've acquired over the week. And guess what? Laundry day comes about once a month. Maybe. Your best hope is a good scrub in a river with some lye soap, if your skin can take it. Feel like trimming your beard? That's a noble ambition. Razors are rare and mostly in the hands of barbers, who double as surgeons. Yes, that's right, if you want to shave and your infected tooth pulled, same guy, same tools. And you better hope he's in a good mood. Let's talk hair. Lice are practically a medieval accessory. Nobles wear powdered wigs, in part, to hide infestations or patchy scalps. Peasants might shave their heads to keep bugs at bay or simply resign themselves to the scratching. You'll occasionally use rosemary, vinegar, or even crushed garlic to fight the creepy crawlies. There's no shame in it, it's just life. And what about ladies' hygiene? Brace yourself. Menstruation is handled with cloth pads, washed and reused, often in less than ideal conditions. There's no running water, no antiseptics, and certainly no discreet disposal. The discomfort is immense, and privacy is non-existent. Still, daily life marches on. You head out into the streets, or muddy path, depending on where you live. It's a miracle you don't step directly into something unspeakable, because remember, waste disposal isn't exactly streamlined. The streets are a mix of slop, animal droppings, and garbage. The occasional pig or chicken waddles past you, minding its own business while contributing to the mess. Oddly enough, many medieval folks are surprisingly concerned with cleanliness, just not in the way you expect. Ritual washing of hands before meals is fairly common. Monasteries often have running water systems, and Islamic cities like Baghdad and Cordoba are centuries ahead of Europe with public baths and sewage systems. In fact, some of the most advanced hygiene practices of the time come from regions often overlooked in Western textbooks. Back in Europe, if you're a noble, you might own a personal comb, a silver ewer, or even a scented pomander to hang around your neck and cover the stench. Royals occasionally bathe in rosewater or milk, decadent, yes, but also largely ineffective. And even they often smell like a mix of lavender and goat. You start to itch. Congratulations! You've probably got fleas. That bed you slept on last night? Prime real estate for every jumping insect in a 5-mile radius. There's also a non-zero chance you've picked up scabies or a touch of ringworm from a borrowed cloak. You'll learn to live with it. Everyone else does. By midday, the sun's warmed up the outhouse, if you have one, just enough to turn it into a hotbox of horror. If you're in the city, the smells waft into your tiny home through cracks in the walls and the single tiny window. Good thing your sense of smell has already started to shut down as a survival mechanism. Let's not forget about dental hygiene. A medieval smile is, let's say, rustic. Tooth decay is common, and if you have a toothache, expect it to end in one of 3 ways: exorcism, herbs, or having the whole thing yanked out with iron pliers. Sometimes all 3, in that order. You might chew on mint or fennel seeds to freshen your breath, but it's a losing battle. Oral hygiene, as we know, it is a distant dream. You glance in a bucket of water and catch your reflection. Sunburned, greasy, possibly home to a few spiders. You're not sure. What's more, your skin is rough from wind and soot, your nails are rimmed with soil, and your nose won't stop itching from the wood smoke of your neighbor's eternally smoldering hearth. And yet, somehow, people still fall in love, make friends, and get on with life. They gather for festivals, wash their best tunic in the river, braid their hair with ribbons, and hope that when they light incense, it covers at least some of the stink. Despite everything, they persist. They make do. And so will you. You wake to a faint, earthy smell, wet stone and the faint whiff of ash, as if someone recently doused a torch. You're inside a medieval monastery scriptorium, and no, you don't get to ease into the day. A dull bell rings in the distance, and you, as an apprentice scribe, are already late. Your task: copying the Book of Hours for the 12th time this month. And you thought Excel spreadsheets were repetitive. Welcome to the world of medieval monks and manuscript makers. Contrary to what movies suggest, not all monks wandered in contemplative gardens or meditated under ivy-laced arches. Most of them were overworked, underfed, and slightly ink-stained. The scriptorium is cold, because heating is reserved for the chapel and the abbot's quarters. You hunch over your desk, a wooden plank covered in wax to smooth out parchment. The candle flickers, not romantically, but annoyingly, because you're trying to make your Latin not look like a drunken beetle wrote it. Across from you sits Brother Eustace, whose nose whistles when he breathes. He's correcting your punctuation with a quill like it's a dagger. There's no whiteout, no backspace, only scraping parchment with a dull knife and praying no one notices. The hours crawl by, marked by bells, lauds, terce, sext, none. Between prayers, you copy. Between copying, you pray. Then copy again. This is your life, 6 days a week. Here's the twist. For many monks, this was a privilege. To read, to write, to access ink and parchment was elite stuff. In fact, the production of manuscripts shaped not only religious life but the future of European literacy. Entire libraries depended on people like you, peering through candlelight with dry eyes and cramped hands. The church was, essentially, the publisher of the Middle Ages. But don't romanticize too much. Illumination, those gorgeous gold and blue designs, was not done for beauty alone. Often, it was used to mark key passages for quick reading aloud during services, or to demonstrate divine glory via shimmering visuals. But it also allowed monks a rare outlet for creative flair. Some even doodled dragons, snails jousting knights, and dancing rabbits in the margins. Historians still argue whether these were symbols of satire, secret protest, or just boredom unleashed. You might be wondering, how did one become a monk anyway? Usually, you were given to the monastery as a child, especially if your family had too many sons or owed favors to the church. Once inside, the rule of Saint Benedict governed your life: silence, obedience, humility. The rule was detailed enough to cover when to speak, rarely, what to wear, scratchy wool, and how to eat, simply, and not too much. You didn't choose dinner, dinner chose you. Often some variant of vegetable stew, again. Monks were also expected to fast frequently, sometimes over 100 days a year. Not for a summer body, but to purify the soul. But fasting didn't always mean starving. Creative loopholes existed. For instance, fish was often exempt, and beavers were considered fish. That's right. In some monasteries, beaver tails were a Lent delicacy. Tastes like repentance. Beyond spiritual life, monasteries doubled as medieval innovation hubs. Monks were early agronomists, brewers, herbalists, and cheesemakers. They kept bees, recorded astronomical observations, and even ran rudimentary hospitals. The pharmacy was your herb garden. The cure for insomnia: poppy syrup. Toothache: chew cloves. Headache: tie a crushed lavender poultice to your temple and hope divine mercy intervenes. You're assigned to herb duty today, lucky you. Out in the garden, bent over sage and rue, your back begins to ache. An elder monk tells you stories about Hildegard of Bingen, a revered abbess and mystic whose medical knowledge impressed bishops and barons alike. She believed in balancing the body's 4 humours through herbs, chant, and, oddly enough, spelled amulets. Historians still debate whether her remedies were proto-science or divine inspiration. At night, you retreat to the dormitory, a long, cold hall filled with sleeping bodies under thin wool blankets. Privacy. What's that? A cough echoes. Someone snores. A bell tolls again. Matins, the midnight prayer. You rise, shuffle back to the chapel with the others. The floor is freezing, and you forgot your sandals. Again. Sleep deprivation was standard. Monks rarely got more than 4 to 5 hours at a time, interrupted by regular prayer. The church believed that waking to chant praises in darkness kept you spiritually alert. In practice, it kept you perpetually groggy. Monks often napped at odd hours, during meals, at desks, sometimes mid-prayer. If you dozed too obviously, you might get nudged with a disciplinary stick. Yes, it was a real thing. Despite all this, monks could live long lives. Clean water, structured schedules, and avoidance of warfare helped. But old age didn't exempt you from chores. Elder monks still swept cloisters, prepared ink, or led chants, albeit with more wheezing. One ancient brother insists he saw the relics of Saint Cuthbert glow once. You nod politely, unsure whether it's miracle or memory fuzz. A final note: not all monks lived quietly. Some were spies, scribes for kings, or secret lovers of poetry. The Irish monks sailed to Iceland and beyond, carrying gospel and Guinness. Others challenged church doctrine, precursors to reformers. You begin to realize, behind the silence was a humming current of thought, intention, and curiosity. So as you finally lay down your pen for the day, hands ink-stained, back aching, mind cloudy from psalms and lavender fumes, you realize something important. You're a small thread in a massive tapestry, preserving stories, prayers, and knowledge for centuries to come. All while really needing a nap. You're on the open seas now, swaying on the deck of a modest but seaworthy medieval trading vessel. The salty wind snaps at your hood as the sailors holler in a language that's half curses, half directions. You try to help with the rigging but nearly get flung overboard by a swinging yardarm. Yep, you're definitely not qualified for this. This section sets sail into the ever-changing tides of medieval maritime trade. The medieval world was more interconnected than most people think, and trade was the invisible rope pulling together empires, tiny kingdoms, pirates, and suspicious monks selling holy relics out of a damp crate. You may have assumed things were fairly landlocked back then, but surprise, ships were the arteries of the medieval economy, pulsing with everything from wine to wool. Let's begin with the ships themselves. The cog, the carrack, and the caravel, names you've likely heard tossed around in pirate movies, were workhorses of the maritime age. Cogs, in particular, were thick-bellied, single-mast ships favoured by merchants from the Hanseatic League, a powerful trading alliance based around the Baltic and North Seas. These ships weren't fast, but they could carry a staggering amount of cargo. You can imagine trying to squeeze barrels of salted herring next to bales of Flemish cloth and crates of quarrels for crossbows, all while keeping your pet monkey from eating the dried figs. A day on board. Let's say, it's not for the squeamish. You wake to the smell of old wood, stale sweat, and whatever is currently rotting in the corner. The deck is slick with seawater, and you quickly learn to sleep with one eye open because your hammock is swinging just inches above a barrel of fermented cabbage. Privacy doesn't exist, meals are cold and monotone, and chamber pots are a luxury most don't even bother with. If you get seasick, too bad. The best remedy is apparently chewing ginger or just getting used to vomiting quietly over the side. You're not alone out here. The Mediterranean buzzed with galleys, many of them rowed by enslaved laborious or desperate men promised a cut of the profit. The Venetians, always the savvy traders, practically turned the Adriatic into a private waterway. And while Venice gets most of the glory, Genoa, Pisa, and Amalfi were no less ambitious. Genoese merchants dealt in everything from perfume to pearls, sometimes even renting out entire fleets to monarchs needing a quick crusade. Speaking of which, crusading was an uncomfortably common side hustle for medieval seafarers. One minute you're shipping olive oil, the next you're transporting armed pilgrims to the Holy Land. Did you pack your armor next to your peppercorns? Hope so. Now let's talk about the crown jewel of the trade, spices. It's hard to overstate how valuable these were. Black pepper was worth its weight in silver, nutmeg could buy you a goat, and cloves, well, let's just say you wouldn't leave them unattended at a port tavern. The Portuguese would later dominate these routes, but even in the medieval period, spices filtered their way west from India, Persia, and beyond, often passing through Arab and Jewish traders who marked up the prices in ways that would make a modern boutique blush. Historians still argue whether these markups were due to actual scarcity or just really clever branding. Either way, spice was the Bitcoin of the medieval world. Of course, maritime trade wasn't all exotic flavors and romantic sunsets. Piracy was a constant threat, especially in places like the Strait of Gibraltar or off the Barbary coast. Some pirates were outlaws, others were semi-legit, licensed by rulers to mess with rival merchants, sort of like medieval corporate sabotage with swords. The English called them privateers, a nice way of saying, we're totally not pirates unless we lose. Then there's the cargo itself. While spices get all the headlines, the real bread and butter of medieval maritime trade was, well, sometimes actual bread and butter. But more commonly, wool, tin, wine, salt, grain, timber, and fish. Herring was a big deal, especially to the Catholic world where fasting rules meant you couldn't eat meat on certain days. So fish became holy, and herring became profit. Hanseatic merchants ran enormous fisheries and coordinated entire fleets around seasonal herring spawning. If you were on board one of these ships, expect your clothing, hair, and dreams to smell of fish forever. But hey, it's a living. Sort of. Let's not forget luxury items. Silks came from China along overland routes that linked up with maritime ones. Fine glass from Venice, porcelain from the East, ivory from Africa, all pass through a network so tangled it makes modern supply chains look like hopscotch. The maritime world was the medieval version of Amazon Prime, minus the same-day delivery and plus the occasional Viking raid. Speaking of Vikings, yes, they also had a hand in shaping medieval maritime trade. Initially raiders, they eventually settled into more respectable commercial roles, especially in regions like Novgorod and Dublin. Their longships were uniquely suited for both river and sea travel, making them the medieval equivalent of amphibious tanks, except more stylish and probably better built. Insurance? Well, sort of. Merchants often formed partnerships to hedge their losses. If your ship sank, you lost everything, unless you were lucky enough to be in a group that agreed to share risk. Kind of like a medieval startup accelerator with salted cod instead of software. Point one quirky fact: shiprats were such a problem that some ports required vessels to bring cats. Yes, feline customs officers. And some sailors genuinely believed that whistling on a ship would summon storms. So if you're thinking of humming a tune while on deck, don't be surprised if the nearest sailor glares at you like you've just cursed his entire lineage. Let's drift briefly into the Arabian Sea. Medieval Arab traders were among the best in the world, using the monsoon winds to zigzag their way across the Indian Ocean. Their ships, called dhows, carried not just goods but stories, scientific knowledge, and even musical instruments. Trade was cultural exchange, not just capitalism in a robe. If you're traveling farther east, welcome to the bustling medieval ports of China. During the Song and later the Yuan dynasties, Chinese maritime prowess grew exponentially. The junk ships were enormous, well-engineered, and crewed by professional sailors who probably would have laughed at your clumsy attempts to tie a sailor's knot. Quanzhou, one of the great ports of the age, teemed with foreign traders, bureaucrats, and the occasional Buddhist monk trying to haggle for sandalwood. Of course, all this commerce meant taxes, inspections, and bribes. Port authorities had a keen interest in who was bringing what. Sometimes they'd confiscate cargo under vague accusations like improper bundling, which probably just meant someone forgot to grease the right palm. And let's not ignore the darker parts of maritime trade. Yes, human beings were cargo too. The slave trade existed long before the Atlantic Triangle route, with Africans, Slavs, and even fellow Europeans trafficked across the seas. It's one of the grimmer undercurrents of a world otherwise glittering with silks and spices. Still, for all its hardship and contradiction, maritime trade connected the medieval world in ways that are eerily familiar today. Alliances were forged, wars were sparked, cultures collided, all thanks to a few brave souls willing to risk their lives hauling cinnamon and cod across a capricious sea. You wake up in the damp, flickering half-light of a bustling medieval kitchen. There's no snooze button, just the rattle of wooden spoons, a cook's holler, and the thick smell of wood smoke, onions, and something suspiciously fishy. Congratulations! Today you're the kitchen help in a noble household, and there's no time for yawning. Breakfast for 50 people must be on the long oak table by sunrise, and you're on onion chopping duty. The onions are old, winter-stored, and sprouting eyes, rather like the head cook, come to think of it. But no complaining, she's got a ladle and she's not afraid to use it. Working in a medieval kitchen isn't just physically demanding, it's a high-stakes balancing act of temperature, timing, and temper. You're responsible for feeding not only the noble family but also the servants, guards, visiting clergy, and the occasional unwanted guest who wandered in smelling a roast. The hearth is wide enough to roast an entire deer, which is great until you realize you're expected to turn the spit for 2 straight hours. Your arms ache, your back burns, and you're pretty sure that grease spot on your tunic is never coming out. There's no reward except the honor of doing it all again tomorrow. Oh, and a crust of bread if you're lucky. Your first real lesson. The medieval kitchen is a minefield of hazards. Firewood pops, pots bubble dangerously, and rats scurry underfoot. The cooks sharpen knives with the focus of a blacksmith prepping for war. The term culinary arts is very generous. It's more like culinary combat. A turnip rolls off the table and you instinctively dodge. Good. You're learning. The smell is a heady mix of herbs, sweat, and something boiling in an iron cauldron you're too afraid to identify. You're told it's a stew of eel and oats, cheap, filling, and absolutely inedible unless you've lost the will to live. But it beats starving. And people do starve. Especially when the harvest is poor, or when war disrupts food supplies, or when mold invades the grain and turns your bread into a psychedelic science experiment. Historians still argue whether moldy bread might have contributed to some of the visions saints reported. You just hope it's not what's in your bowl today. Meal planning is surprisingly elaborate. Mondays might be pea soup day, Wednesdays a meat pie if the budget allows, and Fridays, always fish, no matter what. The church's influence over daily meals was real. No meat on Fridays, special fasting days, and holy days that dictated entire menus. Even your diet had to be pious. And if you're not noble, your options shrink drastically. You might eat rye bread every day for months. If you're lucky, it's only a little gritty from the millstones. If you're not, There's sand in your teeth and your stomach still growls. In the larder, preserved goods line the shelves, salted pork, dried fish, root vegetables, and buckets of something pickled. Pickling was your best bet against the apocalypse of spoilage. Without refrigeration, the whole kitchen team had to be constantly planning for the next meal, the next week, and the next season. Salt was precious, spices even more so, and each ingredient came with a social status tag. Pepper, for example, was as good as gold, literally used for rent payments in some cases. You run a finger over a sack of peppercorns and imagine what it'd buy in the village market. Probably a goat. Maybe even a second-hand tunic. And then, there's the spice logic. Rich households threw cinnamon and saffron into nearly everything, not just for flavor but for flexing. Want to show off your wealth? Add cloves to your wine. Want to ruin your servant's day? Ask them to grind nutmeg by hand with a stone mortar. Your wrist still aches from yesterday's spice preparation. But hey, it smells nice. Like if Christmas had to wrestle a mutton stew. Every meal is a theatrical performance. Dishes arrive with flowers and gilded bread crusts. Peacocks are cooked, then redressed in their own feathers and posed on silver platters. No one actually eats the peacock, it's tough and stringy, but it looks regal. Like taxidermy met Top Chef. Meanwhile, you've got a bruise from the goose that tried to escape yesterday. Waste is its own dance. Leftovers go to the poor, sort of. More often they're picked through by higher-ranked servants, then passed down until finally the dogs get a sniff. You'll be lucky to scrape the pie tin with a wooden spoon when no one's looking. The social hierarchy even applies to scraps. And don't forget the table manners. Nobles wipe their hands on the tablecloth, not napkins, because napkins are for Frenchmen, apparently, and they don't eat with forks. Forks are still weird and foreign, and some clerics call them sinful. You, however, stab your beet slice with a knife tip and try not to look hungry. The kitchen is a place of innovation and desperation. Some days, it's roast duck and almond pudding. Other days, it's boiled nettles and dried barley. Sometimes you're instructed to dye your food, green eggs, red porridge, not for nutrition, but to impress bored noble guests. Medieval food wasn't just about eating. It was about performance, politics, and pecking order. And possibly indigestion. The number of herbs and digestive potions passed around after meals suggests no one walked away from dinner without feeling slightly cursed. Then there's the medicine chest, often located just off the kitchen. Because food and medicine were considered closely linked, the cook might double as an apothecary. Sage, thyme, mint, not just for seasoning but for curing headaches, calming nerves, and pretending you knew what you were doing when someone fainted from heat stroke. You mix something vaguely minty and pretend it's healing. Everyone nods approvingly. Work doesn't end when the meal does. You clean. And clean. And scrub. Pans the size of bathtubs, wooden bowls with week-old crusts, ladles sticky with honey glaze. Water has to be drawn by hand, heated over a flame, and reused sparingly. There's no rinse cycle. Just a lot of elbow grease and prayers that no one drops a dish. Broken pottery isn't just inconvenient, it's expensive. And if you're the one who breaks it, kiss your wages goodbye. Dinner service feels like a military campaign. Everyone moves in strict formation. One mistake, and the head cook might declare open war. You carry in roasted meats, trays of candied fruits, and something vaguely fish-smelling under a bread dome. The Lord nods. You survive. Barely. You crawl to your straw bed at night with splinters in your fingers and smoke in your lungs. Your tunic smells like soup, and your dreams are full of flying chickens and angry turnips. Still, you're alive. And tomorrow, you get to do it all again, hopefully without setting your sleeve on fire this time. By now, you're more than halfway through your medieval day, and if you thought things might finally be getting easier, maybe a nice warm meal or a break in the shade, you'd be very wrong. Because now it's time to take a deep breath and enter the chaotic, pungent, and surprisingly bureaucratic world of the medieval marketplace. You arrive just as the sun climbs to its highest point, bathing the narrow streets in heat and dust. The marketplace, nestled in the center of a walled town, smells like a festival of every odor imaginable: sweat, spices, rotting vegetables, mud, manure, and fresh bread all swirl together in one heady brew. Your nose recoils, but your stomach, rumbling from a lack of breakfast and a quickly forgotten lunch, does not. Now, this isn't the sort of tidy market you might find at your local farmer's stand. This is more like organized chaos. Stalls jut out at odd angles, cloth canopies flap with the wind, animals, goats, chickens, the occasional wayward pig, mingle freely with the crowds, and the din is deafening. Barking merchants shout over each other, promising the best apples, the freshest eels, the brightest ribbons, and the most blessed relics. You're jostled immediately. A fishmonger nearly slaps you in the face with a slimy cod. A woman with turnips tied to her belt accuses you of stepping on her child's foot. You apologize profusely and slink toward the slightly less aggressive bread stall. You think of buying some, until you realize you don't have any coin. Because here's the thing, unless you're nobility or clergy, chances are you don't walk around with money. Barter is still widely used, especially in rural markets. So, you eye your sack of eggs, except you don't have a sack of eggs. You have nothing. And now, you're just loitering. A town constable notices. He eyes you suspiciously. He's wearing a battered hat that suggests authority, and his grim expression suggests he's not in the mood for nonsense. You scurry away, pretending you were heading to the cheese stall all along. Now, let's talk about what's actually for sale. Some things are familiar: bread, meat, produce, wool. Others are less so. A woman is selling jars of what she claims is bear fat, excellent for joint pain. Another is hawking love potions made from herbs and, possibly, pigeon feathers. A traveling tinker clinks with dozens of metal pots strapped to his back, shouting about his mending skills. You pass a tooth drawer holding up a bloody molar like a trophy. He winks at you. Oh, and you almost trip over a sack of live frogs. No one explains this. You move on. And then there are the guilds. Now, guilds are serious business. You see signs and symbols hanging above stalls, embroidered cloth for the weavers, anvil and hammer for the smiths, a goose feather for the scribes. If you're not a member of a guild, you're not supposed to sell. But rules bend, especially when the constables are distracted by the ale cart. Speaking of ale, there's plenty of it. Taverns aren't just for drinking. They're central social hubs. Deals are struck, rumors spread, and the occasional song breaks out. You duck inside one for shade. It's dark, smoky, and the benches are sticky. You sit anyway. The man next to you leans in and begins telling you about a talking horse he swears he saw in Normandy. You nod politely. Let's not forget the entertainers. In the square, a juggler with questionable balance tries to keep 5 turnips in the air. A man in a stained robe bellows a sermon while balancing on a barrel. A puppet show recounts the tragic tale of Saint Sebastian, with exaggerated moaning. Children laugh. Adults roll their eyes. You spot a woman balancing a goose on her head. Now, historians still argue whether medieval markets were true centers of free trade or heavily manipulated by local powers. What's certain is that everything, from where stalls were placed to what times merchants could open, was controlled by local lords or town councils. Licenses were issued, tolls were collected, and fines were happily handed out. You wander toward the clothing area, marveling at how many ways linen can be folded, dyed, and sewn. A tailor waves you over and begins measuring your arm, already convinced you'll buy his latest style, a tunic with very aggressive shoulder points. You politely decline. But what about scandal? Oh, there's plenty of that. Behind the sweet-smelling spice stalls and the vibrant dye fabrics, there's a whole black market of banned books, relics of questionable origin, and potions brewed by wise women who may or may not be witches. You hear whispers about someone selling relics who claims to have a tooth from John the Baptist, and 2 stalls down, someone else has the same one. There's even a designated punishment area, in case you forget your manners. Stocks and pillories sit at the edge of the square. People who sold bad meat, cheated on weights, or insulted the wrong guildmaster could find themselves locked in, left to the jeers and occasional thrown cabbage of the crowd. As you browse the mead selection, a nearby vendor tries to upsell you on something called pickled lamprey, which sounds like a dare. You decline and go for a meat pie instead. It's warm, flaky, and surprisingly good, until you realize it might not be pork. You stop asking questions. Eventually, the sun begins to dip, and stalls start closing down. Unsold goods are packed away, children are rounded up, and carts creak as they roll toward home. The air grows cooler, and the square empties, leaving behind only crumbs, feathers, and a suspiciously silent goose. You survived the market. Barely. But your feet ache, your pockets are still empty, and your nose may never recover. As you limp away, you hear a lute strumming a gentle tune. A bard is singing about a knight who got tricked into marrying a frog. It's oddly soothing. So you follow the music and sit for a while, letting the day's chaos drift away. The stars begin to appear. The frog in the song becomes a queen. You close your eyes. You're out of breath, again. Because this time, you're on the move, not walking, not even trudging, but running. or at least attempting to run, in the most inconvenient pair of medieval shoes ever cobbled together. The town's burning, the market's been ransacked, and you're being accused of something you absolutely did not do, owning a duck that speaks Latin. Okay, maybe not quite that, but the hysteria swirling through your medieval village feels just as ridiculous. Welcome to the witch trials. Contrary to what you might assume, not every witch trial ended in a bonfire. But they often started with the tiniest spark, an herbal remedy that worked too well, a neighbor's cow going dry, or a dream involving frogs. You simply made the mistake of boiling rosemary for a headache while humming an old tune your grandmother taught you. And now, the church deacon's niece swears you turned her hair green. Historians still argue whether medieval Europe's witch hunts were more about misogyny, economic jealousy, or genuine spiritual panic. Likely, it was an unwholesome stew of all three, stirred with political instability and served cold with a ladle of theological confusion. You're hauled into a local tribunal. The room smells of mildew, authority, and bitter herbs. No lawyer, no phone call, no real hope of parole. Just a monk holding a very large book and a very small understanding of botany. They ask you if you consorted with the devil. You say no, but in a tone that sounds unsure even to your own ears. They ask if you've danced in the woods at night. You recall your cousin's wedding party. Technically, yes. Then they ask if you can recite the Lord's Prayer backward. You can't even recite it forward under this kind of pressure. The inquisitor leans back, squinting. A jury of 6 townsfolk, 3 of whom once overpaid for your parsley, begin murmuring. Let's pause for a moment and talk about parsley. You thought it was harmless. But in medieval Europe, some herbs were believed to be gateways to other worlds. Sage was sacred, mugwort was mystical, and parsley? Well, parsley was considered suspect. Partly because it took so long to sprout, something devil's delay. Anyway, your fate may now hinge on parsley's reputation. You're not alone. Between the 14th and 17th centuries, thousands of people, mostly women, though not exclusively, were accused of witchcraft across Europe. And though the famous Salem trials happened later and across the Atlantic, they weren't so different in spirit. All it took was an odd behavior, a sudden illness, or being the town's weird neighbor. And here you are, the weird neighbor, with a headache and a rosemary infusion. They test you for the devil's mark. Not a tattoo or any glowing pentagram. No, they poke and prod for numb spots, birthmarks, or suspicious freckles. You're ticklish, which doesn't help. Next comes the water test. Despite your vocal objections, you're led to a pond. The theory goes, if you float, you're a witch. If you sink, you're innocent, but possibly dead. The logic, as you notice, is a bit soggy. You float, but only because your tunic ballooned. The crowd gasps. This may be the moment to mention that some clerics and scholars of the day did try to protest this madness. Theologians like Johann Weyer warned against witch panic, but they were voices drowned in a tide of fear, famine, plague, and an overwhelming desire to blame someone, anyone. You're taken back to your cell. A rat scurries by. You think about the irony of being burned for having a green thumb. The rosemary, by the way, never even worked. Over the following days, you're offered leniency if you name other witches. This tactic was used liberally. One confession could doom 10 others. You remain silent, or try to, but the bread is stale, the water's murky, and your sleep is peppered with nightmares of frogs speaking Latin. A traveling inquisitor arrives. He wears a red robe and smells faintly of saffron and righteousness. He declares your case a high priority. That can't be good. But surprisingly, he calls for an examination by an herbalist. She's kind, sharp-eyed, and possibly a witch herself. She declares your rosemary tea unremarkable. The inquisitor nods solemnly. Your charges are quietly dropped a week later. No apology, just a bored scribe muttering, insufficient evidence. You return home to find your herb garden trampled. A chicken is nesting in your best cooking pot. But you're free. You go to bed that night wondering, did the inquisitor see reason, or did the herbalist slip him something calming in his saffron tea? Historians still debate the true drivers behind these frenzies. Some cite cold weather and crop failure. Others point to shifting power dynamics between church and state. Still others suggest that mass hysteria is, unfortunately, a timeless human tradition. One thing's for sure, you wouldn't last a day in this atmosphere. Not with your fondness for chamomile and your inability to keep quiet when accused unjustly. But for now, you're alive, and the frogs are silent. Your feet are sore now. Not just sore, They feel like they've been chewed on by a bored dog and then dipped in gravel. Still, the castle isn't going to clean itself, so up you go. The sun isn't up yet, but you are, which tells you all you need to know about your social standing in the medieval pecking order. And guess what today is? Laundry Day. Except in the 13th century, laundry is less about fresh lemon-scented detergent and more about hauling buckets of river water while hoping nothing bites you. You stumble toward the stream with your linen shift, a bucket, and some extremely questionable lye soap. The soap smells like someone tried to mix bacon grease and ashes, which is actually exactly how it's made. Lye is caustic and burns like betrayal if it touches your skin, so you wear makeshift gloves, also known as your sleeves. Historians still argue whether people in the Middle Ages actually washed their clothes regularly or just beat them on rocks occasionally and hoped for divine intervention. By the time you've scrubbed your third tunic, your back aches, your hands are raw, and your patience is leaking faster than the bucket. But there's no time for self-pity. You promised the cook you'd help pluck the geese next. Feathers fly into your mouth like aggressive snowflakes, and the goose, very much still alive when you started, is not thrilled about the process. It hisses at you like a tiny feathery demon. You remember a saying, "Don't look a gift goose in the beak." You're not sure what it means, but you do know this goose wants you dead. Back in the kitchen, your reward is a hunk of black bread and a thick onion. The bread could double as a discus, and the onion makes your eyes sting worse than that time you tried to eavesdrop on the Lord's private meeting and got caught. You eat in silence with the other servants, the only conversation being an occasional grunt or the sound of someone choking on the bread crust. Then it's off to the garden. But don't imagine some peaceful, flower-filled plot. No, this is the kitchen garden, a muddy rectangle filled with root vegetables and extremely judgmental cabbages. You dig up leeks while trying not to disturb the snails, who seem more confident about their life choices than you do. One of them, frankly, looks smug. You name him Gregory. He's now your emotional support snail. Someone calls your name, well, not your name, but some version of it shouted with enough authority to make you scramble. It's the steward, who needs you to help carry a barrel of ale to the Great Hall. The barrel weighs more than your hopes and dreams, and the hall is up a flight of stairs. You curse your fate quietly, then louder as the ale sloshes onto your shoes. At least they smell less like goose now. Inside the hall, preparations are underway for a feast. Not for you, obviously. You're there to polish the pewter and try not to sneeze on the trenchers. Trenchers, in case you're wondering, are old slices of stale bread that double as plates. They soak up gravy, meat juice, and whatever else lands on them, and then, if they're not too disgusting, they're handed out to the poor or dogs. You glance at your own dinner and wonder if it came from someone else's trencher last week. Later, you help with entertainment. No, you don't get to enjoy it. You hold the torch for the juggler and try not to get hit by flying turnips. You also help clean up after the Lord's fool, who is, ironically, the smartest man in the room. He gets away with saying anything, including a jab at your posture. You make a mental note to trip him with a broomstick tomorrow. Finally, as dusk descends, the hall's quiet. You're told to prepare the chamber pots. Yes, that's plural. Yes, it's as glamorous as it sounds. Medieval plumbing is a concept best left to the imagination, and yours, unfortunately, is vivid. You collect the pots with a rag over your face and dump them into the castle's waste chute, which is exactly what it sounds like. You pass by the laundry line again and see your earlier work flapping like a sad banner of servitude. One of the shifts has fallen into the mud. You sigh so deeply it disturbs Gregory the snail, who blinks at you in solidarity. Back in your shared room being generous, it's you and 3 other servants in a corner of the attic, surrounded by mothballs and the scent of tired humanity. Your straw bed pokes your ribs like it's holding a grudge. You lie down, exhausted, and stare at the rafters, wondering if medieval people ever got a day off. They did, actually. Holy days were frequent, dozens each year, but they didn't always mean rest. Sometimes you had to spend them standing through hours of mass or participating in bizarre community rituals, like blessing chickens or dancing around with relics. One chronicler described a local saint's feast that involved rolling cheese wheels down a hill and chasing them. Historians still debate whether this was symbolic, celebratory, or just what passed for fun back then. As you drift off, you hear a rat skitter in the rafters. Not unusual. You name this one Percival and decide that, like Gregory, he's probably doing his best. Just like you. Your dreams that night are strange, a never-ending flight of stairs, a goose in a crown, and a juggler throwing turnips at the moon. You wake up briefly, adjust the itchy wool blanket, and then sleep again, heavy and dreamless this time. And so another day ends. You've washed, scrubbed, hauled, plucked, polished, dumped, and served, all before the cock has crowed twice. You didn't die, but you certainly wouldn't want to repeat it. Medieval life may look romantic in storybooks, but from where you stand, with Gregory on your shoulder and Goose down in your hair, it's mostly sore feet and terrible bread.